Imagine you are walking down a street in London. It is 1880. The gas lamps are lit. The cobblestones are wet. You can smell coal smoke in the cold air. You are 22 years old. Your name is Eleanor. You are a seamstress. You have worked 14 hours today. You are walking home. A police officer steps out of the shadows and stops you. He does not ask your name. He does not ask where you are going. He does not need to. He takes you to a medical examination room. He has the legal right to do this. The law says so. Signed, official, enforceable, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing you can do about it. This was not a crime. This was not an accident. This was not a mistake. This was Victorian England, 1880, the most civilized era in modern history, and the truth was far darker than anyone wanted to admit. Most people picture the Victorian era through its achievements: the steam engine, the railway, Darwin, Dickens, Florence Nightingale, a civilization obsessed with progress, with morality, with refinement, and all of that was real. But here is what nobody tells you. The most morally obsessed civilization in modern history was also the most systematically hypocritical civilization in modern history. The men who wrote the purity laws visited the establishments. Those laws were meant to shut down. The doctors who defined female mental illness used those diagnoses to lock away inconvenient women. The institutions that claimed to rescue fallen women imprisoned them without trial, sometimes for life. And all of it, every single layer of it, was completely legal. What really happened behind the respectability of Victorian England? Stay with us, because what you are about to learn will not just shock you, it will change the way you hear the word civilized forever. Let us place you inside this world, Victorian England, 1837 to 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria, the height of the British Empire. London is the largest city on earth. The empire covers a quarter of the globe. The railways transform everything, and inside every drawing room, every marriage, every household, a system of control so complete and so politely invisible that most people living inside it never had a word for it. The first thing you need to understand is a legal concept called coverture. When a Victorian woman married, she legally ceased to exist as a separate person, not metaphorically, not culturally, legally. Her property became her husband's the moment she said her vows. Her wages were his. Her legal identity merged completely into his. She could not sign a contract. She could not open a bank account. She could not sue anyone. She could not be sued in her own name. And she could not refuse her husband. That was not a social expectation. Under the law that had governed England for centuries, the same logic that had shaped medieval marriage law, a wife's consent to everything was considered permanently given at the altar. This was Victorian England, 1880. Think about that. Now here is where it gets darker. Because Victorian society knew all of this. It was not an accident. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate architecture, and the mechanism that held the whole thing together. The thing that made women police themselves without any help from anyone was one of the most sophisticated systems of shame ever invented. Victorian respectability was not just a social preference. It was a survival system. A woman's entire life, her safety, her income, her housing, her children's future depended entirely on her reputation. One whispered rumor, one accusation, true or false, and she was done. Not just socially finished, practically finished. Because here is what the system did that was truly brilliant in the most terrible sense. It punished women for being victimized. If something happened to you, if a man harmed you, if your employer assaulted you, if your husband hurt you, the first question was never what happened to you. The first question was, what did you do wrong? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you resist more convincingly? Why were you there at all? The burden of proof never sat with the man who caused the harm. It sat with the woman who survived it. Meet Eleanor. She is not one real woman. She is every real woman who lived this story. Eleanor is 22 years old. She works in a textile factory in the East End of London. 14-hour days, 6 days a week. She shares a single room with 2 other women. She sends a portion of her wages home to her mother in Manchester. She is respectable. She works hard. She follows every rule she knows. One evening in 1869, walking home from work through Bermondsey, a police officer stops her under the Contagious Diseases Act. You need to understand what the Contagious Diseases Act actually was, because it is one of the most extraordinary pieces of legislation in British history. The Acts, passed in 1864, 1866, and 1869, gave police in designated areas the legal power to stop any woman they suspected of being a common prostitute and compel her to undergo an internal medical examination. Not women accused of a crime, women who were suspected by one officer on the street with no warrant required. If she refused the examination, she could be imprisoned. If the examination found evidence of disease, she was detained in a locked hospital ward called a lock hospital for up to 9 months. Now here is the part that tells you everything about how this system worked. The men who used the establishments the Act was designed to regulate were not examined, not detained, not touched by the law in any way. The official logic, stated openly in parliamentary debate, was that women spread disease. Men were simply the passive recipients. Read that again. The men who drove the demand for the entire industry were the passive recipients. Eleanor was not a prostitute. She was a seamstress walking home. It didn't matter. The officer stopped her because she was young, because she was poor, because she was walking alone at night, because she fit a profile. She had no legal recourse. She had no one to call, no record of her name, no protection from the law, because the law was the problem. And in the examination room that night, Eleanor understood, perhaps for the first time with absolute clarity, exactly what Victorian civilization thought she was worth. I want to stop here for a moment, because I want you to think about what that law meant in practice. If you were a woman in one of the Contagious Diseases Act designated areas, which eventually covered most major British naval and military towns, you could not walk home from work at night without risking a police stop and a compelled medical examination, simply for existing in public. While female, while poor, what would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments, because the answer to that question tells you everything about what choice actually means when the entire system is designed to eliminate it. Now let us talk about something that should stop every person watching this cold. In 1885, a journalist named William Thomas Stead published an investigation in the Pall Mall Gazette. He called it the maiden tribute of modern Babylon. It was the most explosive piece of investigative journalism the 19th century had ever seen. What Stead uncovered, with the help of a former brothel keeper and a Salvation Army reformer, was a systematic, organized, and entirely legal trade in young girls in London. And the central fact at the heart of it was this: the legal age of consent in England at that time was 13 years old. 13. This was not an oversight. Parliament had debated raising the age just 2 years before Stead's investigation, and they had failed to pass the bill, failed to raise the age of consent above 13. In 1883, Stead's investigation documented the purchasing of girls as young as 13 legally with their parents' permission, and in some cases with the girls having almost no understanding of what was being arranged for them. To prove the story was real, Stead purchased a 13-year-old girl named Eliza Armstrong from her mother for £5. He documented everything. He published everything. The public response was volcanic. Hundreds of thousands of people signed petitions. The largest street demonstration Britain had seen marched through London. Parliament passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act within months. The age of consent was raised to 16. But here is the part nobody talks about. Stead was arrested, tried, and sent to prison not the men who had been buying children, the journalist who proved it was happening. He had purchased Eliza without getting her father's consent, a legal technicality, and the courts used that technicality to imprison the man who had exposed the entire system. The men he named continued their lives completely undisturbed. This was Victorian justice. Now let us talk about medicine, because here is where the control becomes truly invisible. Victorian medicine had a diagnosis for women who were difficult, who refused, who expressed anger, who showed too much grief, who challenged their husbands, who had feelings that were inconvenient for the men around them. The diagnosis was hysteria. It was treated as a genuine medical condition, completely legitimate, completely scientific. Women were institutionalized for it, committed to asylums, sometimes for years, sometimes permanently, and the criteria for what counted as hysteria were designed, whether deliberately or not, to pathologize the completely normal human response to an abnormal situation. A woman who cried too much. Hysteria. A woman who refused her husband. Hysteria. A woman who showed romantic interest outside her marriage. Hysteria. A woman who was consistently and justifiably angry at her circumstances. Hysteria. The diagnosis essentially meant this woman is behaving in ways that are inconvenient, and the treatment options ranged from the patronizing, rest, removal from intellectual stimulation, to things that by any modern standard would be considered assault. Women who protested their treatments were documented as showing symptoms of their condition. The logic was circular and perfect. Resist treatment, and your resistance proves you need the treatment. You cannot win a system designed so that every response you give confirms the conclusion it already reached. If this kind of hidden history is what you are here for, subscribe to Ancient Mindcast right now. Every week we go deeper than the history books are willing to go. Subscribe. It is free, and it keeps this channel alive. Now let us talk about the men. Because no honest examination of the Victorian era is complete without addressing the extraordinary, documented, completely shameless double standard running through every layer of Victorian society. Victorian England had the largest commercial intimate industry of any era in European history. Contemporary estimates, made by Victorian reformers themselves, not later historians, placed the number of women working in London alone at between 60 and 80,000. And the men who used these establishments were not hidden. They were not ashamed. They were members of Parliament. They were judges. They were the same men who publicly signed purity legislation, donated to church organizations, and gave speeches about the moral foundation of civilization. Nobody held them accountable, because the system was not about morality. It was about who was permitted to have desires. Men's desires were a natural fact of life, an inconvenience to be managed certainly, but fundamentally human, understandable, forgivable. Women's desires were a moral failure, evidence of fallen character, a social contamination requiring treatment and isolation. The woman in the industry, whatever path brought her there, was the sinner. The man who created the demand for that industry was the respected citizen. Both of them were inside the same system. Only one of them was paying the full price. Now here is the part that is not ancient history, not in any comfortable sense. The Magdalene laundries were institutions run primarily by Catholic religious orders, but also by Protestant organizations across Britain that took in women considered morally fallen. Unmarried mothers, women who had been assaulted, girls considered too pretty or too flirtatious by local priests or magistrates, women referred by their own families, by courts, by police. Inside these institutions the women worked, every day, unpaid, in laundries, washing the clothes of hospitals, hotels, and private families, generating income for the institutions that held them. Many of them could not leave, not technically imprisoned, but with no money, no documents, families who had surrendered them, and communities that had already shamed them. Leaving was a theoretical freedom with no practical reality. And here is the fact I need you to hold. The last Magdalen laundry in Ireland closed in 1996, not 1896, not 1096, 28 years ago. The women who entered those laundries in the 1970s are alive today. That is not history. That is a living memory. And the logic that built those institutions, women's bodies as a problem to be managed by institutions rather than by the women themselves, was the same logic that built the Contagious Diseases Acts, the hysteria diagnosis, and the age of consent. At 13, the chain is unbroken. It just wore different clothing in different centuries. Now I need to give you the single fact that stopped me completely still when I found it. In 2013, just 11 years ago, the Irish government published the Macalees Report into the Magdalen laundries. It found that some women had been admitted by their own families as children, girls as young as 9 years old, and some of those women, committed as children, were still there. Decades later, still washing clothes every day, still unpaid, still unable to leave, their entire childhoods, adolescences, and adulthoods taken inside walls that had decided, when they were 9 years old, that they were a moral problem. 9. And the theology that produced that decision did not begin in Victorian England. It was inherited from centuries before, from Augustine's framework that positioned female desire as the source of sin, from medieval church doctrine that said women's bodies required containment and management. The chain from a 4th century theologian to a girl locked in a laundry in 1965 runs unbroken through every era this channel covers. It is the same story, different century, different uniform. So why? Why did this last so long? Why did it work so completely? Victorian England was not a civilization of ignorant people. It produced Darwin and Dickens and Nightingale. It was full of people who genuinely believed in progress and reason and the improvement of the human condition. And yet it built and maintained a system of total control over women's lives with complete sincerity. The answer is always the same answer. Control over women was control over reproduction, and reproduction was the engine of everything. The Victorian family was not just a social unit, it was an inheritance unit, a property unit. The entire architecture of Victorian wealth, class identity, and social stability was built on the predictable transfer of property through legitimate bloodlines. A woman who moved freely, chose freely, refused freely, was a structural threat, not a moral failure, a structural threat to the entire system. And this is the hardest part to look at. The system was not maintained by monsters. It was maintained by the Victorian doctor who committed a woman for hysteria and genuinely believed he was helping her, by the magistrate who referred a girl to a Magdalen laundry and genuinely believed he was protecting the community, by the family who surrendered a daughter and genuinely believed they had no other choice. None of them saw themselves as villains. They were doing what the system trained them to believe was right, and that is the most unsettling part of all of this. The most complete systems of injustice are not built by evil people. They are built by ordinary people who cannot see the system they are inside, because the system has been there longer than they have. Let me show you how recently this ended. In England, a wife's legal right to refuse her husband was not recognized until 1991. The Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed in 1886, but only after years of organized campaigning by reformers, including Josephine Butler, who built the first major women's public advocacy movement in British history. Married Women's Property Act, 1882. That was the year women in England could first own property in their own name after marriage. Women could not vote in national elections until 1918. Full equal voting rights came in 1928. These are not ancient milestones. Your great-grandmother was alive in a world without them. Eleanor never got to vote. She never got to own property. She never got to refuse. She never had the right to be justifiably angry and have that anger mean something legally. But Josephine Butler did fight, And because she fought, along with thousands of women who risked everything to push, things shifted, slowly, incompletely, with enormous resistance at every step. But they shifted, and the direction of that shift is the only story worth telling. Before you go, 2 questions. Question 1. The Victorian men who publicly championed morality and privately participated in the very system they legislated against, were they hypocrites, or were they simply people who could not see the system they were inside? Because that question has an uncomfortable answer, and it does not only apply to Victorian men. Question 2. The last Magdalen laundry closed in 1996. Some of the women who lived inside those walls are alive today. What do we owe them? Not as a government, not as a society in abstract, but as people who now know this happened. Leave your answer below. I read every single one. If this video gave you something, share it with one person. Just one. Subscribe to Ancient Mindcast if you have not already. And next week, we are going to ancient Rome. I promise you, it is worse than you think.